Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to... Sorry, it's been a bit of a long break because I was in England celebrating a big birthday, and so it's been 3 weeks. So I'm back, and I'm going to review the new book by Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines, which my friend Colin gave to me for my birthday. Thank you, Colin. And this is what it looks like. And of course, these guys are not new to Beatles fans because back in 1983, they came up with The Love You Make. Same writers, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I thoroughly enjoyed the new one. I would recommend it. It's not without its flaws, as I'll come to, but I think they're both very decent reads. And as Pattie Boyd said, she couldn't think of anyone better than Peter Brown, in a better position than Peter Brown to tell the Beatles story. I mean, he really was close to John and Paul in particular, and was around Apple during the last couple of years, and he was at John and Yoko's wedding in Gibraltar, and he was at Paul and Linda's wedding in Marylebone in London, and he introduced Paul to Linda, no less, although Paul sort of jokingly claims that's not the case, and Peter Brown had nothing to do with it, but I think deep down Paul knows that Peter Brown did actually introduce her to him, because he knew her from I'm not sure how he knew her, but he was quite friendly with her, and she came over to him in the club to say hi, and Peter Brown was sitting next to Paul. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, I was, having read the new book, I went back and read this one, and I'm nearly finished. In fact, I didn't read all the way through, I kind of skipped through some of it, but I think it's very engagingly written. It's a little bit sensationalist. These authors do tend to concentrate on the sensational aspects of the Beatles story, but I don't think they're overly negative. I know the famous story that Paul and Linda burnt this book page by page on the bonfire because they weren't very pleased with it. But I don't think it reads particularly anti-Paul. I don't know what you guys think. Anyway, so the first thing to say about the new book is they could have done with a better editing job. It's pretty poorly edited. I don't know if they used AI or ChatGPT or something, but you've got phrases like "shouldering on" appear in the text. And of course, it should be "soldiering on." By the way, Invisible Ray says, why have I not done a rebuttal to the new Mind Games deluxe box set? Well, I did see the announcement, and I noticed that, there's this big cube, and they're selling it for $1,350, which is $350 more than the All Things Must Pass giant box. And it's almost as if they're trying to outdo each other with these ridiculously priced deluxe box sets. I guess some people will go out and buy them because they're limited edition, but to me it's a complete waste of money, and it's pretty gratuitous money making to put them out in the first place. So that's my piece. But I will be, of course, listening to the new Mind Games on Spotify and just not shelling out loads of dollars on these box sets. Back to the book. So pretty poorly edited, and in some cases the English is even though most of the people interviewed are English, it doesn't read like proper English half the time, and you're wondering, did he mean that word, or did he? I'm not sure how because they obviously, most of this new book is sort of verbatim transcripts of the interviews they did for the first book, so you wouldn't have thought there was too much room for error, but sometimes it reads like a kind of rudderless stream of words. And I guess some of the interviews some of the people interviewed may have been intoxicated perhaps, or they were rambling, I'm not sure. But anyway, so it's very entertainingly written. I think most of the credit for that would probably go to Stephen Gaines, because he probably turns Peter Brown's stories into kind of proper prose, and he knows, I wouldn't be surprised if he'd written for a tabloid newspaper, because he knows how to write a sort of a gripping story. And anyway, so this new book, it's, as I say, preparation for the first book, they did loads of interviews with all the people connected with the Beatles in the last weeks of October and November of 1980. So what makes it interesting is you've got interviews from back then, which obviously just before John died, and a lot of the interviews are quite candid, and it's very refreshing because, and you've probably noticed over the past 30 or 40 years, Paul has become a little bit repetitive in his interviews, and obviously John's death, I think, has altered the way he would talk about John. If John was still around, they would probably be more open and critical of each other, perhaps. I'm not sure. But I will pick out some excerpts which I found absolutely fascinating from Paul, George and Ringo. But before then, I'm going to talk about some of the other people interviewed in the book. Alan Klein, very long chapter. And although he loses me slightly when he's going on about the NEMS deal, lots of numbers flowing around, and he's obviously a talented businessman, and I get the impression that Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines do not like Alan Klein at all, and they're really quite negative to him. But I think one has to balance that out with the fact that Klein did do some good, and Ringo remarks, well, maybe it takes a thief to catch a thief, and he always enjoyed the company of Alan Klein, and if he had to go to dinner with him, he had no problem. The authors press Alan Klein on whether the Stones were ripped off by him, and whether Mick Jagger warned John Lennon against him. And Alan Klein was rather put out by this question and said no, and it was quite the opposite, in fact. So anyway, I find Alan Klein a fascinating character in the Beatles story, and I don't think he deserves the thoroughly negative reputation that he's got by and large, because he did do some good stuff, not to mention a couple of things like the Red and the Blue compilations he put together, the Hey Jude American compilation he put together. So just that alone is pretty remarkable. Magic Alex, another character where the authors do not like him. They've got it in for him. They do give him, time of day, and they interview him, and they put down in print what he said. Did you actually see the Maharishi trying to seduce a girl in India? And Magic Alex was basically saying he saw it through the window. Anyway, I'm not sure if I believe that, but anyway, Magic Alex is another one of these sort of colourful, slightly mad characters which graced the Beatles circle, and I think the Beatles story would be less colourful without people like Magic Alex and without Alan Klein, I would say. Maureen, Ringo's wife, is interviewed. Very interesting interview there, particularly when she's asked about George declaring that he was in love with her, and she was saying how embarrassed she was. But they don't go into much detail, but that's a nice candid interview with Maureen. Neil Aspinall, quite a nice interview, but his grasp of dates is terrible. He was talking about Let It Be, and he said, well, it was recorded in July and August and then scheduled for release in November. I think it couldn't really be more inaccurate than that, because obviously it was recorded in January and then scheduled for release in the summer, and then it got delayed, eventually released in May 1970. But so yeah, his grasp of dates is not good, but he's very close to the Beatles, and he's got good things to say, and it's interesting. Bob Wooler is who was the bouncer at the Cavern Club, and obviously they go straight for the obvious question about Brian Epstein and John going on holiday in Spain, and Bob Wooler refuses to rise to the bait and says to Peter Brown directly, will you still be friends with the Beatles after this book, Peter? Which was quite a prophetic remark, really. Queenie Epstein, Brian's mother, very interesting interview. She's asked, do you think it was suicide or accidental? And instead of denying it and saying, of course it was accidental, she said quite candidly, we'll never know. So I thought was quite interesting. Ron Cass, the former head of Apple Records, very dismissive of the Beatles in terms of their being appalling judges of character, he said. And they're just Liverpool lads who didn't have a clue how to run a business. And he recounts this hilarious argument about whether to put a green line round the edge of the apple or a white line, and John wanted white and Paul wanted green, and so he eventually compromised and put a white circle around the cut apple on the B side and a green circle around the apple on the green apple on the A side. Apparently that they had to put a circle around in the early days for copyright reasons. I don't think that lasted. Anyway, Cynthia, not a bad interview with her. Yoko interviewed just after John died, and they're very much concentrating on John's heroin addiction and how John and Yoko may have been going to the London clinic for heroin withdrawal. And Yoko's having none of it, and who knows if it's true or not. But even if it is true, so what? It's not that important. And in the book, in the foreword to the book, I think Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines are saying if there's one reason, they said it in both books actually, if there's one reason why the Beatles broke up, it's probably the most important one. It's John's heroin addiction. Which I think is a little bit of a crass remark, because I don't think you can say that was more important than Alan Klein coming in or Yoko and Linda coming in or musical differences. After all, Keith Richards in the Rolling Stones was on heroin for a 10-year period between 67 and 77. And the Stones made their best work during that period, so I don't think John being on heroin for what was less than a year, really, I don't think that was a major factor at all. It's obviously regrettable, but I don't think it sort of spelt the Beatles' demise. So we've got loads of other people interviewed: Alistair Taylor, Pattie Boyd, Jenny Boyd, Nat Weiss. Peter Brown's talking about the Manila experience. Very, very good stories. He seems to have been, I don't think he went to Maharishi camp, but he seems to have been present at most of the other Beatles events of the late 60s anyway. Dick James, the publisher of Northern Songs, who famously sold Northern Songs and really pissed off John and Paul in '69. So the authors are saying that what you did was underhanded and blah blah, and George Harrison gave him a really hard time over this in the Apple office one day. And Dick James is defending it, saying he went to see the Beatles on the Let It Be set, the Get Back set. He saw John and Paul not getting on. He saw George stomping around, not happy, saying, we've been here 4 hours and we've got 2 bars down. So Dick James thought, okay, this is the end of the Beatles. Northern Songs is going to go down the pan. I better sell it. And he's saying even that he still reckons it's the best decision he ever made. When, of course, with hindsight, in the long run, Lennon and McCartney as an entity and as a songwriting sort of piece of history, it doesn't diminish just because the Beatles split up. It sort of lives on, really, regardless of that. So the authors of the book are a little bit infatuated with marital infidelity and drug addiction. But I think that's a fairly minor criticism. As I say, it's a very entertaining book, and I got it. Colin gave it to me on the Saturday, and I think I'd finished it within 4 or 5 days. The other people mentioned, too many to mention, really. John Dunbar, the guy, and the authors rather cheekily say, infamous for introducing John to Yoko. Well, what's infamous about that? You should say famous. He's famous for that because John and Yoko turned out to be a pretty interesting couple together, and all the music and art they created together. Ray Connolly, the journalist, is interviewed. Jeffrey Ellis, Derek Taylor, very amusing. I think he had had a few drinks when he did his interview. John Eastman, Linda's brother, giving his side of affairs versus the Alan Klein version. So I think I've covered David Putnam, the filmmaker. Well, he says a very strange thing. He says John Lennon put the steel into Paul McCartney's music. Paul McCartney came up with marvelous little motifs. And, a lot of songs were not finished. Well, excuse me, what are you saying? I mean, you could say that You Never Give Me Your Money is snippets of songs put together, but, what about all the other songs which Paul did, which are totally and utterly complete? I don't really get that remark. Anyway, I'm now going to read you a couple of excerpts from the Paul, George and Ringo interview. Well, this is Paul speaking in and what's claimed to be the last interview before John died, but I'm not sure if that's true, because I think he did a Good Morning America November the 27th. So I'm pretty sure that was the last interview. Maybe that doesn't count as a real interview because it was only 5 minutes or so. But this is I'm not sure if this is a very long interview either. But so Paul is saying, he's asked, were the other Beatles anti-Linda? Yeah, I should think so, like we were anti-Yoko. But you know John and Yoko, you see it now. The way to get their friendship is to do everything the way they require it. To do anything else is how to not get their friendship. This is still how it is with John and Yoko. I know that if I absolutely lie down on the ground and do everything like they say and laugh at all their jokes and don't expect my jokes to ever get laughed at and don't expect any of my opinions ever to carry any weight whatsoever, if I'm willing to do all that, then we can be friends. But if I have an opinion that differs from theirs, then I'm sort of an enemy. So I thought that was very interesting. You don't hear Paul talking about his relationship with John like that. And then there's another bit where, he's knows that John wanted an indemnity against the taxman. And this was one of the reasons he didn't settle the court case to dissolve the Beatles partnership. And so Paul went to New York to try and offer a sort of olive branch. I went to New York feeling like the bringer of good news. I rang him up. Hello, John, how are you? Hello, how's the kids? Oh, great. What's all this about publishing? Yeah, great. Laugh, laugh, laugh. What about Apple? Tense. You know, that was the unfortunate thing in the last 10 years. The moment you mention the word Apple, all of us go, eep. Dread and horror and shock goes through all our systems. I said, look, as I understand it, you need your indemnity. John said, King indemnity, King this, King that. You don't need to give me King indemnity, you King. I think we ended up sort of swearing at each other. I said, F you, you big C word, because I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't be sweet and reasonable anymore. I was shaking for an hour after that. That is very interesting. I'm not sure what year that would have been. Sometime in the late 70s, I'm guessing. So then we've got the George Harrison interview, November 1980. Stephen Gaines says, I'm going to interview John when I return to New York. George, you'll probably think John is a piece of shit, you know. He's so negative about everything. Stephen Gaines, why is there so much tension after all this time? George, I don't know, because after 5 years of him being at home, for me, I thought I'd feel really good. Any bad feelings over things that might have happened in the past have long since been forgotten. And John, after 5 years, I would have thought it'd be great. And then he comes out in the paper and it's not what I feel so much as what everyone else is saying. What's wrong with John? He's become so nasty. It sounds like he hasn't moved an inch from where he was 5 or 6 years ago. Stephen Gaines, well, maybe he has bad influences around him. George, well, that was one thing about John Lennon that hit me too, a long time ago. Very candid, priceless stuff, really. And then Ringo, Stephen Gaines reminds him that the Rolling Stones are still going. Yeah, but they're old men. If you want to take it the other way, Dylan again is very bright. He was mentioned in People, and in the interview they asked, what about the Beatles? And he said there were 4 of them. And then that 1980 interview with Ringo, he's saying that Paul wasn't talking to him at the time. So I'm not sure what they'd argued about. But I just found it very interesting to have those interviews from 1980, because as I say, I think all the Beatles changed their tune a bit when they were interviewed after John's death, whether it was talking about each other or just in general. I think they became more guarded. And I think these interviews are amongst the most candid of their entire careers. So I recommend this book. It's a little bit of a pointless title, All You Need Is Love, The End of the Beatles. I don't know if it's meant to be ironic, but the picture on the back has John and Paul and sitting with Peter Brown, the bearded guy, sitting behind the table. So yes, he's more than qualified to write a book like this. And I would recommend it. I think it's well written and it's not too sort of nastily, it's not pointed too negatively against anyone. He's quite fair on the whole. So anyway, that was that book, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.